The air inside the officers' club hung thick, a heavy, expensive blend of old money, polished oak, and the faintest ghost of high-grade cigar smoke clinging to the velvet drapery. It was a smell that spoke of quiet power, a scent too refined to be found in any enlisted bar, a subtle chemical reminder that every decision made within these walls carried the weight of continents and careers. The lighting was low, amber, designed to flatter the expensive scotch and hide the subtle exhaustion lines around the eyes of men and women who hadn't slept soundly since their last deployment rotation. It was a camouflage of comfort, a deliberate attempt to soften the jagged edges of a life lived on the cusp of chaos. And then there was Lieutenant Jax Riley. Jax didn't smell like the club. He smelled like expensive, aggressive cologne, a synthetic, manufactured confidence that cut through the aged leather and wood. He was 26, built like a blueprint for modern war, all sharp angles and restless energy, his dress blues immaculate, pressed with razor sharpness, radiating the certainty of a man who'd been told his entire life that he was destined for greatness. He was standing near the bar, talking too loudly about a training exercise, punctuating his anecdotes with a forced barking laugh that echoed crudely off the sound-dampening walls. He had arrived only 30 minutes prior, yet already his presence felt like an unwelcome draft in a meticulously temperature-controlled room. The old guard, the colonels and majors nursing their single malt whiskeys, cast quick, irritated glances in his direction, their expressions communicating a universal, silent thought. Rookies. But Jax wasn't looking at them. His gaze had locked onto the far corner booth, the prime real estate of the establishment, usually reserved only by explicit tradition or unspoken rank. Seated there was a woman. She was an anomaly. Not because she was female, there were several senior officers present, but because of her absolute stillness. She was Evelyn Thorne, though Jax didn't know her name. He only saw the silhouette of elegance, tailored charcoal suit, the fabric subtly catching the ambient light, expensive shoes barely visible beneath the table's fringe, and a silver bracelet that caught the light only when she delicately lifted her crystal glass. Her hair, the color of wet sand, was pulled back severely, exposing the clean, powerful line of her jaw. She was not beautiful in the typical, soft way. She was striking, almost intimidatingly composed, possessing the kind of mature authority that required no uniform or insignia to declare itself. She was reading. A physical book, not a tablet. Its cover a muted, academic gray, resting open on the dark wood. She held her glass of amber liquid, a neat pour, definitely not a cocktail, and occasionally she would sip, her eyes never lifting from the page. To Jax, her stillness was an invitation, her solitude, a challenge. He interpreted her quiet confidence as boredom, her reserved demeanor as a high fence waiting to be climbed by the most persistent, most charming suitor. He saw himself as that suitor. He saw a trophy. He waited for a breath, smoothing the lapels of his uniform jacket with meticulous care, catching his own reflection in a nearby framed portrait of a long-dead commandant. He flashed himself the kind of blinding practice smile that had worked on every civilian girl he'd encountered since OCS. He took one last, deep breath of manufactured courage and started his approach, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply on the imported marble floor. Every sound he made seemed amplified in the hushed environment. He stopped directly beside her table. The scent of his cheap, aggressive cologne, now mixed with the adrenaline of the pursuit, wafted over her subtle, clean aroma. "Excuse me, Commander," Jax said, using the lowest rank he thought appropriate for someone in this section of the club. His voice pitched slightly too high, intended to be charming, landing instead as grating. Evelyn Thorne did not look up. She did not twitch. The only sign that she had registered his presence was the slow, measured pause before she turned the page of her book. The tiny, almost imperceptible shh of the paper was louder than his voice had been. "I apologize for the interruption," Jax continued, convinced that this subtle rebuff was merely part of the ritual, the necessary resistance before the surrender. He leaned closer, violating her personal space with the ease of a man accustomed to getting his way. "But I have to say, seeing a woman of such obvious poise and depth sitting alone in this zoo, it's a crime against social interaction." He paused, expecting the polite laugh, the shy lowering of the eyes. What he got was the continued silence of the grave. Evelyn finally raised her eyes. They were a startling icy gray, flat and completely devoid of emotion. They registered him not as a handsome young officer, but as an object, a particularly loud piece of furniture that had suddenly appeared within her periphery. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply looked at his chest, settling her focus on the 2 gold bars that marked his rank. Lieutenant, junior grade perhaps, barely wet behind the ears. "Can I help you, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice a low, gravelly alto, utterly neutral, like the voice of a drone operator thousands of miles away. It had no inflection of interest or dismissal, merely the sound of someone performing a mandatory duty. Jax took this as his cue. "Only if you let me buy you a proper drink. This water you're sipping looks lonely. Allow me to introduce myself. Lieutenant Jax Riley, just transferred in from Quantico. We should celebrate my arrival, don't you think?" He pulled out the chair opposite her, a clear breach of etiquette in this club, which demanded permission before intruding on a reserved table, and sat down without waiting for an invitation. He placed his elbows squarely on the table, invading the small, sacred zone of her personal space. Evelyn Thorne's composure did not break, but something tightened around her eyes, a minute tension that spoke volumes to anyone who understood the language of threat response. Jax, of course, did not understand that language. He only understood conquest. "I appreciate the offer, Lieutenant Riley," she said, her words carefully measured, each syllable distinct. "But I am not lonely, and this is not water, and I am not interested in celebrating your arrival." Her bluntness barely registered with him. He was accustomed to parsing veiled resistance. He interpreted her refusal as high standards, something he was eager to meet. "Come on, ma'am, it's the officers' club. We're supposed to relax. Let the tension out," he said, injecting a lazy, practiced familiarity into his tone. He leaned forward, attempting intimacy. "I see you're reading something heavy. Need a distraction?" "I'm an excellent distraction. Ask anyone." He winked. It was a gesture of supreme, youthful arrogance. Evelyn slowly closed her book, marking the page with a thin, brass bookmark. The movement was economical, precise. It felt less like ending a chapter and more like preparing for surgical action. She removed her reading glasses, thin, almost invisible frames, and placed them carefully inside the book. The gray eyes, now unimpeded, focused on him completely. The temperature of the interaction dropped perceptibly. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice dropping even lower, now possessing a distinct edge of danger, like static electricity before a storm. "I will be explicitly clear. This is my dedicated quiet time. I am not looking for company. I am not looking for distraction. I am looking for silence. Your persistence is rapidly moving from merely annoying to officially disruptive." Jax laughed, the forced, aggressive bark again. "Disruptive? Lighten up, Commander. What are you? An auditor? Look, let me get that waiter over here. We need refills. Mine's a double bourbon neat. What are you drinking, Scotch? Is this a Macallan 18? Let's make it 2. He didn't wait for her reply. He scanned the room imperiously, his hand raised. He spotted the closest attendant, a man in a perfectly tailored dark vest and crisp white shirt, tending to the nearby bar station. The attendant was older, perhaps mid-50s, with closely cropped gray hair and the kind of ramrod straight posture that civilian life rarely allows. He looked less like a waiter and more like a retired Special Forces NCO who took the concepts of service and protocol far too seriously. Jax snapped his fingers, loudly, sharply, a sound entirely inappropriate for the reverence of the setting. The sound sliced through the ambient jazz. The attendant paused his task of polishing a glass, his hand freezing mid-motion. He turned slowly, his face expressionless, completely professional, but there was something in the stillness of his eyes, a depth, a weary wisdom, that should have served as a warning sign. "Waitress!" Jax called out, his voice laced with the entitlement of his newly acquired rank. "Table service here. 2 refills. And be quick about it, will you? We don't have all night." Evelyn Thorne watched the interaction. Her face remained a mask, but the corner of her mouth twitched downward infinitesimally. It was a look of profound disappointment, not at the waiter, but at the lieutenant's spectacular lack of judgment. The attendant, the waiter, began walking toward their table. His pace was measured, unhurried, yet somehow conveying instant obedience. He moved with a practiced grace, the kind of movement trained by decades of knowing exactly where every limb is supposed to be in relation to the center of gravity, a grace that few civilians ever acquire. He reached the table and stood slightly behind Evelyn, placing himself in a position of protective service toward her, subtly framing the exchange. Jax missed this entirely. He saw only a hired hand. "Sir?" "You called?" the man asked, his voice a low, controlled baritone, refined by years of speaking into radios and through diplomatic channels. "Yes, I called," Jack said, leaning back confidently. "Listen up. I need a double bourbon, neat, and the lady needs a refill of whatever expensive amber poison she's drinking. Don't water it down. And maybe try to smile next time you're addressing an officer, all right?" Jax punctuated the instruction with a light, dismissive wave of his hand, indicating that the service was beneath his serious attention. The attendant's eyes, dark, intelligent, and startlingly steady, flickered briefly to Evelyn Thorne. It was a lightning-fast exchange, a single shared glance that lasted less than half a second, but in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them. A recognition, an acknowledgement of the situation, and a question silently answered. Evelyn gave the smallest possible nod. Permission granted. The lesson may proceed. The attendant turned his full attention back to Lieutenant Riley. The professional mask of servitude, however, began to crack, replaced by something ancient and chilling. "I apologize, Lieutenant," the attendant said, his voice now steel wool, rough and absolute, "but I cannot fulfill your request for service." Jax's jaw dropped slightly. His privileged bubble of entitlement had been punctured. "You can't? Are you serious? What is this? Amateur hour? Look, I'm an officer of the United States Marine Corps, and I'm ordering a drink. Are you suggesting you can't perform your job?" "I am suggesting, Lieutenant," the attendant corrected, his posture growing even more rigid, somehow expanding in the close space, "that I do not serve you." Jax's face flushed scarlet. He stood up, towering over the attendant, allowing his youthful fury to boil over. This was beyond disrespect. This was insubordination from a hired civilian, and he wasn't going to tolerate it. "Listen here, buddy," Jax spat, jabbing his index finger threateningly toward the attendant's pristine vest. "I don't know who the hell hired you, but I'm going to make sure you're scrubbing latrines by morning. You do not defy an officer. Now, you get me that bourbon, and you get it now." The attendant didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his vest, slowly, deliberately. The movement was calculated to draw maximum attention, maximum dread. Jax momentarily froze, suddenly registering the man's sheer physical presence and the unnatural calm in his dark eyes. Was he reaching for a card, a phone, or something else entirely? The attendant produced not a weapon, but a thin, engraved platinum card, an exclusive membership credential for the club, reserved for the highest echelons of command. He held it out to Jax, not for him to take, but merely for him to observe. Jax, confused and furious, squinted at the card in the low light, trying to read the microscopic etching. He was distracted, missing the true fatal flaw in his perception. The attendant then reached his hand up, just barely touching the star pinned above his left collarbone. The pin was subtle, dark, designed to be inconspicuous in this semi-formal attire, but undeniably there. And then Jax finally saw it. Not the pin on the vest, which could be anything, but the stars embroidered subtly into the collar of the crisp white shirt beneath the vest, visible only due to the careful angle of the fabric. 4 of them, gleaming, unmistakable, 4 silver stars, aligned perfectly, radiating authority so immense it seemed to pull the light from the room. The air evaporated from Jax's lungs. The sound of the jazz music, which he had successfully ignored moments before, suddenly felt deafeningly loud. He looked back up at the attendant's face. The professionalism was gone. In its place was a weary, icy patience, the look of a very powerful man who had just been treated like a subservient drone by an insolent child. This was not a waiter. This was General Marcus Vance, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, arguably the most powerful uniformed man in the Western Hemisphere, known universally throughout the military as Bulldog. He was in his rare, cherished off-duty uniform of the club, meant to blend in, meant to demand respect through presence, not stripes. And Jax Riley, a 2-bar lieutenant who barely knew which end of a map was up, had just snapped his fingers at him and ordered him to smile. The general didn't need to say a word. The raw terror blooming on Jax's face was sufficient communication. In the ensuing absolute silence that had descended upon the entire club, because the moment the general's rank was revealed, every officer within earshot had frozen mid-sip, mid-sentence. General Vance slowly pivoted on his heel. He didn't look at Jax again. Jax Riley had ceased to exist as anything other than a monumental error. General Vance walked the short distance back to the service bar, his movement now imbued with an undeniable heavy command presence. He ignored the professional club bartender, who had just stepped back against the wall, pale with apprehension. The general picked up the specific bottle of amber liquid, the Macallan 25, the club's finest, reserved for commanders, and poured a perfect measure into Evelyn Thorne's glass. He picked up a polished crystal tumbler, not touching the rim, and carried it back to the table. He didn't hand the glass to Evelyn. He gently set it down in the exact spot where her previous drink had rested. It was an act of personal, respectful service that spoke of long-standing familiarity and profound deference. Evelyn Thorne, still seated, still impeccably composed, finally acknowledged the man who had been called a waitress. She met General Vance's eyes and gave him a faint, almost imperceptible salute with her index finger as she wrapped her hand around the chilled crystal. General Vance did not return the salute. Instead, he placed both hands flat on the polished table, leaning slightly forward toward the utterly paralyzed Lieutenant Riley. His voice, when it came, was not a shout or a growl. It was a deep, resonating whisper, carrying the chilling authority of someone accustomed to speaking into the silence before battle. "Let me be clear, Lieutenant Riley," the general said, enunciating every syllable as if delivering a final, damning verdict. "She is not interested. She never was, and she certainly won't be now that you have demonstrated the refined social graces of an ill-bred goat." Jax could only manage a choking sound, trying desperately to formulate an apology, a retraction, a plea for immediate transfer to the Antarctic. The general continued, his gaze absolutely merciless, raking over Jax's uniform, lingering on the 2 gold bars of his rank with contempt. "You had the temerity to snap your fingers at a general of the army," Vance stated, the words slicing through the heavy air. "That is unforgivable. That alone will ensure your career arc stops exactly where it began." He paused, letting that truth settle into the lieutenant's rapidly cooling core. "But your true error, the one that seals your fate, the one that tells me everything I need to know about your catastrophic lack of situational awareness and respect for the chain of command," General Vance continued, his eyes now flicking momentarily to Evelyn Thorne, "is that you assume the woman sitting here, entirely relaxed, quietly reading, whose drink I personally procure and deliver, a woman whom I consider my valued superior officer in this very institution, was nothing more than a conquest for a strutting, self-important recruit." Evelyn Thorne took a slow, deliberate sip of the fresh Macallan. The scent of the aged whiskey momentarily masked the stench of fear emanating from Lieutenant Riley. General Vance straightened up, his height and presence returning to full, intimidating measure. "This is Commander Thorne, Lieutenant," the general stated, using a rank Jax had already assigned her, yet the general's delivery made it sound like a rank far too low for the respect being shown. He leaned in one last time, his voice dropping to a final brutal register. "She is not, oh Commander, nor even your Commander. She is Admiral Evelyn Thorne, Fleet Command, Special Operations. She holds 5 stars, son. 5 stars, on active operational status, serving unofficially under deep cover, because the kind of mission she runs requires her rank to be fluid and her presence to be unnoticed." He pointed to the subtle brass bookmark still resting inside her closed book. "The insignia you assumed was a generic club pin is the official seal of the Joint Special Warfare Command. You just insulted the woman who signs my deployment orders. You ordered her personal security detail, me, to hurry up and smile." Admiral Thorne raised her hand slightly, signaling to Vance that the lecture was complete. She had drunk enough to savor the moment, but not so much as to lose her edge. General Vance instantly complied, stepping back into the shadow, resuming the posture of the most formidable, highly ranked bodyguard in the room. Jax Riley stood frozen, his entire worldview shattering around him. Admiral Thorne, 5 stars, Fleet Command. She was one of the most mythic, ghost-like figures in the modern military apparatus, the architect of operations that entire battalions only read about in sanitized debriefs. She was the one they called Viper 1 in hushed tones, the rumored genius who had restructured global counter-terror doctrine, and he had tried to hit on her, using a pickup line about her being lonely. The humiliation was absolute, total, crushing. His career hadn't just ended, it had been detonated. Admiral Thorne finally looked directly at him, a flicker of something almost pitying in her gray eyes, though it was quickly replaced by cold finality. "Lieutenant Riley," she said, her voice now containing a specific, quiet authority that echoed across the profound silence of the club. You have mistaken silence for weakness, and civilian clothes for lower rank. In the operational theater, such a catastrophic failure of judgment would lead to mass casualties. She reached out and picked up her book, slipping the thin reading glasses back onto the bridge of her nose. Her attention was already shifting away, the lesson delivered and digested. "General Vance," she murmured, without looking at him. "Admiral," the general replied instantly, acknowledging her implicit command. "Please ensure that the lieutenant understands that I find his lack of respect for established hierarchy deeply disturbing. Recommend immediate review of his fitness for duty, effective now. And, General, next time, please let them snap the fingers one more time. The sound is quite clarifying." General Vance gave a single sharp nod that could have shaken mountains. "Understood, Admiral. My apologies for the incomplete lesson." Admiral Thorne took one last sip of her Macallan 25, setting the glass down with a soft, final thud. She rose slowly from her seat, a movement of such innate dignity that it seemed to make the room shrink. She did not bother to spare Jax another glance. She walked past the bar, her step silent on the marble, disappearing through the heavy oak doors, leaving behind the powerful scent of her composure, the aged whiskey, and the lingering sharp smell of Lieutenant Jax Riley's profound, career-ending failure. General Vance remained standing, radiating a calm, controlled menace. He looked at Jax, who was now trembling uncontrollably, sweat beading on his meticulously gelled hair. "You should move, Lieutenant," the general advised, his voice still low, but now carrying the chilling certainty of administrative doom. "I suggest you report to the duty officer and begin drafting your resignation letter. Effective immediately. You don't belong here. You never did." The general waited until Jax Riley stumbled backward, knocked his chair over with a clumsy clatter, and fled the sacred space of the club. Only then did General Vance pick up the fallen chair, straighten it precisely, and wipe the small, dark stain of bourbon from the tabletop that Jax had spilled in his terror. He then walked back to the bar to continue his job as the Admiral's assigned, deeply respected, and occasionally necessary club companion. The silence in the officers' club remained thick, heavy with the weight of the demonstrated hierarchy, a potent lesson delivered through the elegant curve of a crystal glass and the sharp snap of 4 silver stars. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments. Ye.